Hello everyone. Now that you have given your exams, I hope that you have done well. It is also wise to analyze the paper because not only because you need to assess your performance, but also you need to course correct in case you've made any mistakes, etc. It will always be good for other students who take this exam as a learning experience. So keeping that in mind, we'll be analyzing in this video. I'll be discussing 10 questions of paper 2. Those 10 questions are specifically related to polity. Now, when you look at the entire paper, there are 20 questions, out of which 10 are related to polity, and 6 are related to governance, and 4 are related to IR. So I thought that thematically they should be separated. Thematically, they should be separated. IR should be separated from polity, and polity should be separated from governance. That is why I'm doing 3 different videos on this, because governance requires a different approach, polity requires a different approach. Now, as far as this discussion is concerned, it is more about model answers. I'm speaking less about the analysis, like in the analysis it's about the paper in general, but I'm just making some observations here and there. A specific analysis video is, or a specific analysis is needed, that overall paper, like what exactly has changed from the earlier. Some observations I'll be making here. Now, if you look at the paper, when you compare the papers with others, like the other papers, I find this paper tougher. For when I say it is tough, slightly moderate to tough, but if I look at the general crowd who are general, I mean the aspirants in total in general, I find paper 2 slightly challenging for 2 reasons. One is comparatively, this paper was challenging. Second is it is also challenging because of the source which you are defined and confined by. Lakshmikant is generally the source you refer, and what I've been seeing over years is that Lakshmikant is becoming redundant, at least with respect to means, because it is not like core polity questions were not asked and governance questions were asked more, which was the case last year or the year previous to that. Core polity questions they have asked this year, very central to polity. But despite that, if you are sticking only to Lakshmikant, I don't think so any of the 10 questions you will be able to do by Lakshmikant. Leave any of the 10. None of the questions, the 15, 16 questions can be attempted only through Lakshmikant. So this is a clear signal that UPSC wants you to get your syllabus right, because there is a clear understanding that Lakshmikant does not cater to the syllabus of mains. It may at times cater to prelims, but that too is dicey these days. So one lesson which you have to clearly draw from this is read or work on your syllabus properly, because nothing is out of syllabus. It may be out of Lakshmikant, there is a difference. So that's one thing. Second thing is, as far as the video is concerned, 10 questions I'll be discussing, so it may go a bit lengthy. So in that case, we want to identify why, if you want to just watch one video, one question specifically in the model answer for that, time stamping will be given in the comment section and also in the description of the video. You can go for that particular question only. And I said, as far as the analysis of the paper, that would be a different video altogether. This is particularly with the model answers. The first question is 10 markers. So first 5 are 10 mark questions, the next 5 are 15 marks. There is a need for specification of procedure for disqualification of the persons found guilty of corrupt practices under the Representation of People Act. RPA is clearly given in your syllabus. So what does it say? It says, if you look at the subject of the question is Representation of People Act. So about this, it is asking, what it is saying, there is a need for specification of procedure, okay, for disqualification. The specification of procedure, it has to be, what it says is, it needs to be made less complex, etc. and all. So in this context, what is the word is incorrect. It is, there is a need for simplification, not specification. The simplification of procedure. So basically what it is saying is, RPA procedure is complex, it needs to be simplified. What are the parts of the answer? First is what is the procedure given, under which sections it is given, what are the complexities about it, part 2, what is the simple procedure you are giving, part 4, why that simple procedure is needed. When I talk about the corrupt practices, section 8 deals with disqualifications, under which section 8.3, 8 clause 3 and section 8a. These are the clauses which deal with disqualifications under corrupt practices. So what it is said in the section 8.3, it says that if a person convicted of any offense not less than 2 years, he may be disqualified from the date of release. Sorry, from the date of such conviction shall continue for a period of not less than 6 years. That's one clause. Other than that, it also talks about section 8a. Section 8a is particularly about the corrupt practices. These are listed in section 19, which talks about the corrupt practices. What are the corrupt practices like bribery during electoral malpractice and all? In such a case, you'll be disqualified under section 8a. Now, what I'm trying to say is basically there are two sections which talk about the procedure. That itself is a complexity. Now, there are further complexities. Now, you are proving that a person is guilty of corruption under Prevention of Corruption Act here in section 8.3, or you're proving it under section 8a. The list of offences are given in section 99. Now, who is going to prove that? That is through a High Court. Now, in High Court, how do you go through? That is through an election petition. First, you filed a petition, then the High Court gives it a ruling, and High Court is already it's embroiled in many cases. Disposal rate is very weak. So thereafter, you can also go to Supreme Court within 45 days of the ruling of the High Court. This is the overall procedure. Now, what is the problem? Problems of complexity. First is why multiple sections. When I say multiple sections, there is 8.3, there is 8a. And there is also a difference in terms of classification. In 8.3, there is Prevention of Corruption Act. In 8a also, there are corrupt practices which are spoken about. Now, what it says under 8a, there is a clause which says that in case the Election Commission of India feels that there is a need to cut down the punishment. Suppose someone is given the punishment of 5 years, it needs to cut down. It can cut down the punishment only if it is under 8.3, not under 8a. So Election Commission of India does not get the authority to cut down the punishment. So in 8a, there is a difference in treatment of offences. 8.3 offences are treated differently, 8a offences are treated differently, and this has led to a misuse also. Recently, Sikkim CM, who was convicted under Section 8.3, Prevention of Corruption Act, his disqualification has been cut down. So first you are going to the judiciary, you are getting convicted, then disqualification process happens through the president approval. Thereafter ECI gets the power, so it is undercutting judiciary, there is misuse. So first thing is multiple sections on corruption. The second is with respect to treatment, how we are treating Section 8A and Section 8.3 differently. And Section 8.3, through that you can undercut judiciary. ECI is undercutting the judiciary. So that is another thing. And High Court delays, as said, because everything happens through the High Court. High Court deals with the cases. Thereafter, it comes to the President. In terms of High Court delays, the number of cases, disposal rate, etc. Other than that, it goes to the Supreme Court. There is a lot of delay in all of this. What it particularly leads to is corrupt practices and corrupt politicians acquiring power. Now, how do you simplify the process? There are two ways of doing it. Either you have a tribunal, specific tribunal for it, and there is a provision in the RPA itself which says that Parliament can make or Parliament can establish tribunals for dealing with electoral disputes. It is there in T323B also, tribunal sections. Now, tribunals can be established, but there is some problem here because Chandrakumar case says that tribunals, you have to go to High Court, appeal, then Supreme Court. This may also be a tedious process. What you could do is, rather than that, you could also designate specific benches under High Court which deal with only these cases for faster disposal rate. Along with that, remove all these anomalies. 8.3 is one section, 8A is another section, cutting down punishment under 8.3, not allowing it under uniform. It is what you bring. So uniformity not only in laws, there is a need for simplification of the procedure is what you're trying to do. What you're saying is because what you're concluding, because what you're trying to conclude, unless you have politicians who are free of corruption, you won't have a strong democracy, because democracy, if it has to be for the welfare of the people, you need politicians who are clean, and that is how you're trying to conclude. That is the fourth part. Second question, recent amendments to the Right of Information Act will have profound impact on the autonomy and independence of the Information Commission. So the subject of the question is recent amendments. The key words is profound impact on this too. So first you have to explain the recent amendments. You may introduce also with RT and all, but I'm reserving it for the end, conclusion. The recent amendments which were passed, they are amending two sections of the RTI. That is, if you look at the section 16 and 27, but two provisions particularly. So 16 and 27, that is term and salary. The term and salary was fixed through the Parliamentary Law, Right to Information Act 2005, 5 to 65 years in case of the Central Information Chief Information Commissioner, and 5 years for the other information commissioners. Whatever it is, that was a parliamentary defined one. Salary, in case of salary, CIC was equal to CEC, and other information commissioners were equal to election commissioners. And if you look at the state information commissioners, they were equal to SEC, and information commissioners of the state were equal to, their salary was equal to the chief secretary. This is how it was governing. What does the amendment do? The amendment says that the term will now be determined by the executive. Second is, it also says that the salary will be determined by the executive. These are the amendments it makes. Now, basically what it is saying is the term and salary of the information commissioners will be determined a prerogative of the executive. How does it harm autonomy and independence? The first thing is, you need tenure, security of tenure and salary for independence, because courage or RTI's independence autonomy lies in a sustenance of tenure. If your tenure is at the mercy of the executive, then you will not be functioning independently. An independent institution may be Central Information Commission, Election Commission of India, they should be separated from the executive. They should be not the handmaiden of executive. This is what this amendment is doing. Second thing is, this is a clear conflict of interest, because two or RTA or that organ should be separate from the center. Now, when you are curtailing this, RTA or CIC becomes a projection or an extension of the government. So RTI is about information about the government. So if it has to function independently, there should be an independent body. Now, if this is an extension, this body is an extension of the government. Any information which is needed by the people against the government, or which may embarrass the government, their RTI or the body will not function independently, because their term and salary or tenure and salary is a prerogative of the executive. Not only this, it is a pure violation of Supreme Court ruling, which has given a clear ruling in R. Gandhi versus Union of India case, where it is said 2010, where it has said very clearly that for the independence of the institutions, tenure and salary is a primary thing. Without that, independent institutions cannot function independently. Not only this, it affects, because it's all about centralization of power, autonomy and independence is being compromised. So not only that, it is not only taking away powers of the institution, is taking away powers of the lower institutions, that is state institutions also, because it is changing the provisions related to State Information Commissioner and also other Information Commissioner of the State Information Commission as a body. So through this, federalism is also under threat, and federalism is a basic feature. Procedural violations, if you look at the bill violated many procedures. There was no public consultation policy, it was not put in the public domain, because by public consultation policy, 30 days it should be put in public domain. Not only this, it's a violation of the Act itself. Section 4(1)(c) of the Act says that in case you want to make any policies which affect the people, you have to put it in public domain, no public consultation was held. So all of this, somewhere or the other, violates the spirit of the Act. So what you're writing is the original spirit of the act was to create a statutory mechanism and an independent body which will make the government functioning transparent and accountable. Now, through this, both of them, autonomy, independence, transparency, and accountability, all of them has been compromised. Now, the only route how it can be corrected is the judicial route, because judiciary has already given one ruling on RTA where it said that the appointment process has to be put transparent, it has to be put in the website, selection committee meetings only. So that route is the only route which can restore its original spirit, is what you're trying to conclude. Third one, how far do you think cooperation, competition, and confrontation have shaped the nature of federation in India? Cite some recent examples to validate your answer. Now, all of these questions are not covered by the standard textbook. So when you look at the federation, or when you look at the terms, there are three different terms, and it is asking you to give some recent examples. Three different terms related to federation in India. Now, cite examples, recent examples it is talking about. First thing is, when I look at three different terms, I get an idea about federalism, so I write an introduction which addresses all three. First thing is, federalism in anywhere for that matter is not a static entity. It keeps on changing with changing circumstances. It could be political, economic, and social circumstances. And as a result, what do you see as a static design, which is given by the constitution, may not necessarily remain so in practice. And India has seen that change over period, is what you're trying to introduce. Thereafter, you talk about three different sections: cooperative, competition, and confrontational, and give the examples. So cooperative federalism means what? Federalism is basically a relationship between center and state, and state and state. Cooperative federalism is one which aims to promote cooperation between the center and the state. Is it given in the constitution? Yes. It's a constitutionally mandated federation. Under Article Federalism, under Article 258, there is mutual delegation of functions. 258 and 258A, there is mutual delegation. That is an example of cooperative federalism. GST Council, which was added recently under Article 279, which was created recently under 279, that's also an example of cooperative federalism where center and state are cooperating. So I gave a recent example also of cooperative federalism. Next is competitive federalism. What is competitive federalism? Competitive federalism is a kind of federalism where there is the competition promoted between the two states, and whichever wins out of two states, that state will bargain with the center. This is also called bargaining federalism. This idea, bargaining federalism, is not given in the constitution. It has developed over the due to politics of time. The first phase of bargaining federalism emerges in 1967, 70s, then 80s, then 90s also. So these are the phases of bargaining federalism, because bargaining federalism, what I said is states bargaining with the center. When will the states bargain with the center? Center grows weak. So till the time of Nehru, till Lal Bahadur, till 67, center was strong. There was no debate about federalism. In 67, first coalition experiment happens. 69, first coalition experiment happens. And then you have, in 13 states, Congress loses. That is first stage of bargaining federalism. You see that Tamil Nadu plays a role in foreign policies, that is bargaining with the center with respect to Tamilians. In Sri Lanka, 1980s, Rajiv Gandhi signing many accords with Punjab Accord, Assam Accord 1985, which is in use. All of those are bargaining federalism. Now, a recent example about bargaining federalism is post 1990 states are competing with one another to promote or to attract FDI, Singur issue, or anything which comes from outside. How is the state managing? This is another example. What is confrontational? So you can, for competitive or cooperative federalism, you can, recent example also, you can give center state division, which has been established in Ministry of External Affairs, is trying to promote center state coordination in foreign affairs. That's also an example of cooperation. Next is confrontational. Confrontational means where center state are at loggerheads. Center does not respect the opinion of the states. So this has been seen in recent times where there is a confrontational mode. There are different instances of this. For example, you talk about GST compensation, there was a confrontation. In terms of farm bills, actually farming sector belongs to the state, that has been hijacked. And third is with respect to governor's office, how governor's office is being used to interfere in the affairs of the state. Example is West Bengal, elections. Kerala also, there is interference. This is called confrontational, where the center is not open to discussion. So at the end, what you're trying to do is, what you're trying to say is avoid confrontational, promote cooperative, and manage bargaining. Managing bargaining means what? If bargaining, so avoiding confrontation, promoting this one cooperative is fine. Bargaining federalism should be checked because excessive competition may lead to fight among states. So that healthy competition is what a center should promote, is what kind of is the conclusion you are giving. Next, the judicial system in India and UK seem to be converging as well as diverging in recent times. Highlight the key points of convergence and divergence between the two nations in terms of their judicial practices is the word. So it is talking about, subject of the question is India and UK. The words are converging and diverging in recent times. So first is given introduction of comparative aspects, comparative politics it is, where you're comparing two different systems, political systems. So what you're trying to say is, you talk about India and UK have adopted two similar political systems, but there is a slight difference. India has parliamentary federalism, UK is parliamentary unitary system. So because of this, you have a difference in terms of judiciary. So our judicial system, so we may resemble in terms of political system with the UK, but in terms of judicial system, we resemble US more because US has a federal government. India has also adopted federalism. That kind of an introduction you can give. But still, there are divergences, there are convergences, is what you're trying to answer. So first is, despite being different, there are convergences, is what you're trying to say. So despite having unitary and federal differences, there are principle of separation of power is clearly followed. And India and UK are similar in one aspect with respect to judicial system. Though India is a federal country, that India has a single integrated judicial system. UK also has the same because UK is already unitary. Tribunal systems is there in India, 323A, 323B. There is tribunal system even in UK. Next is minor criminal and civil offences are dealt by the lower courts and all. Similar is the process here. They are handled by the magistrate courts. Now, for more serious crimes, there is appeal. That is why it is single integrated judicial system. So there is subordinate judiciary, high court, then there is Supreme Court. And as far as the removal of the judges is concerned, it's all the same because their removal is by the parliament. Here also you have by the parliament only. So that thing is common. Now, where exactly is the difference? The difference is UK does not have a written constitution. So where does the judiciary come from? The judiciary has evolved. It relies on conventions, traditional knowledge. It's very recently that Constitutional Reform Act has been passed to give it a legal backing. But in India, judiciary comes from the Constitution. Supreme Court, there is a separate chapter. High Court, there is a separate chapter. Power, subordinate judiciary, there is a separate section. Everything has been in detail given in the Constitution. So the judiciary comes from the Constitution. Here it is reverse. Constitution keeps on changing the interpretation, etc. Judicial interpretations keep adding to the laws of the parliament. So parliamentary laws and judiciary is what make the constitution. That is the rule of A.V. Dicey. That is reverse in UK. In India, it is different. The other thing is the judicial system. I said gradual. It has been in UK. It has been a gradual evolution. And very important thing is, since constitution itself emerges from whatever judiciary is saying, there's a reverse process in parliament. Parliamentary law itself is the constitution. There is no concept of judicial review in UK. Judicial review concept is there in US and India, that is examining the constitutionality of laws. A law made by the parliament can be examined whether it is whether it is according to the constitutional principles or not. No such power is there in UK. Now, what I proved in this is, yes, political systems determine, but there are convergence and divergences. And the convergence and divergence in recent times is this, giving legal backing, and it is almost moving towards India, but at the same time it is moving towards what Indian practices, but also it is different still, is what I'm trying to say. Next, once a speaker, always a speaker. Do you think this practice should be adopted to impart objectivity to the office of the Speaker of Lok Sabha? What could be its implications of the robust functioning of parliamentary business in India? First of all, that's a very conventional question. These were debates which existed long back. Now, these have been revived because there have been threats to, because questions have been asked which are in political discourse today. RTA has been affected, independent institutions are being affected, federalism is being affected. So you see questions revolving around these only. Independent institutions, they have asked RTA. Federations, if you look at federalism, they have asked with respect to two questions on federalism only. One which I've already discussed, next is related to Disaster Management Act, etc., etc. And also related to how the parliament is functioning, because there is an idea that the presiding officers are not, there is an allegation that there is presiding officers are not functioning independently. And in Rajya Sabha's presiding officer, we have seen in terms of farm bills. So that in that context, it has been asked. Now, first is address this statement, this practice, what it is. Then you talk about Indian case and how it will be helpful if we follow it in India. So what is once a speaker, always a speaker? In UK, there is a practice. The practice is what? Once a person is appointed as speaker, the next thing which will happen is he no longer will remain attached to a party. He is not a party member. That's one thing. Second thing is, once the person is elected the speaker, after that, he will only be contesting elections. No other party will pitch a candidate against him. So that means your term will be renewed if you want to. Your term will be stopped only if the person doesn't want to continue as a speaker. That is what you mean by once a speaker, always a speaker. So there are two things in it. One is there is a guarantee of office that once you're done, once you're part of this, you'll get the guarantee of the next time also. Second is there is nothing, so no one is, you're not externally tamed by anybody. Second is you're above party now because party does not matter to you. So this is a practice as a healthy practice, because what I mean, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha as a body requires independent functioning, impartial proceedings, impartial way of functioning of the House. As a result, because if the speaker is from the ruling side, it will always create problems. So this is what is followed as a healthy practice in UK. Now this has been asked in a present context. In why? I mean in India's context, should we follow this practice? Now India does not have that practice, and conventionally it has been so that speaker is inevitably belongs to the ruling party. Now, due to which many problems have been created, and there was only one speaker who had actually resigned from the party, that is Somnath Chatterjee, but he was not treated well, or he was not, I mean, after he resigned from the membership of the party, CPI did not treat him well as a member because it thought that he disowned the party. So, looking at all this, it feels that, I mean, you need this kind of a practice in India. So in this context, why do you need is how it will affect the functioning. Now, how it will affect? One is it will bring non-partisanship. Speaker is the head of the House. He conducts the proceedings. In proceedings, there are opportunities to ask questions. There are opportunities of questioning the government. There are opportunities of discussions. Now, in this, you need a fair proceeding which is needed. Now, fair opportunity to everyone. Now, if you look at the conduct of the Rajya Sabha chairman, wherein he did not allow the second stage of voting, that is vote by division or vote by standing during the farm bills, clearly shows that the officers are not performing their functions independently. So there is a need to build some institutional or good practices into it. So fair opportunity to everyone, conduct of the proceedings. A very important thing is speakers deal have the power of power to decide over defection. Now defection is, now when you're ruling over defection, there is always a need to be neutral. So here there are two ideas in defection. You have to respect the, you have to, when you talk about defection is allowed in certain cases, defection is not allowed in certain cases. But many a time, speakers do not follow the law. They favor the ruling party. Even if a person is resigning, we have seen in various cases. So resignation is not accepted, then they are I mean, they are they are tried under defection and all. I mean, all of these proceedings under defection are initiated. And what is happening in this? Favoring the ruling party, sitting on the cases, not disposing of the cases. And also in all of this, speaker becomes a party member and not the member of the parliament or the head of the parliament. And more importantly, he is curtailing the dissent of the MPs also. So all of this are problems with respect to speaker. So all of this can be curbed with this standard practice of once a speaker, always a speaker. Other than that, MPs, so other than most important thing is the very idea that speaker should be neutral is essentially encapsulated in an idea called casting vote. Now, casting vote will make true sense, or true spirit of casting vote will be implemented only, or will come into practice only with this kind of a practice of once a speaker and always a speaker. So this is needed in India, is what you're trying to strengthen India as a parliamentary system, because India has adopted parliament as the central institution to govern this country. Okay, so that kind of a conclusion you can give. Next is Indian Constitution exhibits centralizing tendencies to maintain unity and integrity of the nation, elucidate in the perspective of the Epidemics Act 1897, Disaster Management Act 2005, and recently passed Farm Acts. Now, basically, it's a very big question, needs a detailed understanding of what exactly happened. And also, this was a probable question because COVID affected federalism in through various ways. So basically, what you have first addressed this statement: does Indian Constitution exhibit centralizing tendencies? That is the first part. Then look at the act. In the event of pandemic, this was invoked. This was Epidemic Disease Act also was invoked. Do you think they are centralizing? And if they are centralizing, did the center actually follow the real spirit of the act? And now then the third part is farm bills. These two acts have to be read together because they are closely related in the event of pandemic, the DM Act and also the Epidemic Diseases Act. So first is, if you look at the federalism tendencies, the federalism tendencies in India are what? First is India has centralizing tendencies, because if you look at the federalism in India, as far as the debate of federalism in India is concerned, India talked about federalism, debate about federalism starts in Government of India Act 1935 only. But the government of, under that, India wanted a strong federalism. But over a period, what happened is, due to partition, constitutional framers, even people, strong federalists like Nehru and Ambedkar, they believe that they change their idea. They say that there should be some sort of unitary tendencies because that might affect the territorial integrity of India. Now, as a result, Constitution has two different tendencies. One is devolution tendencies. There are centralizing tendencies. For example, Office of Governor, All India Services, emergency provisions, etc. and all. So you give the unitary tendencies, you give the devolving tendencies, and also give the historical aspects. So through this, you are addressing the first one. Now, thereafter, what you have to argue is whether these acts are in spirit of these aspects or not, the spirit of Constitution. Now, first is DM Act. Disaster Management Act was passed in 2005. And what was the mechanism? Whether it is a centralizing tendency or a devolving tendency. First thing is, I'm explaining the spirit of the act and how it was invoked during the time of pandemic. When you look at Disaster Management Act is a centralizing tendency because first thing is, there is nowhere in any list 1 and list 3, because that is where the union list, or so this central government has to make, or parliament has to make a law. Neither in list 1 nor list 2 this power exists. Sorry, list 1 or list 3 concurrent list. So in where did the union invoke the power from? There is an entry 97 of uh, list 1, and it was invoked in, so it was basically some residuary powers directly who did not have, it is in the context of the residuary powers this idea was invoked. So disaster as an idea was appropriated by the center, which was not particularly given in the constitution. So constitution had centralizing tendencies, but it was not related to this subject. This was this was just a breach by the parliament. Whether this breach is legal, illegal, etc., that we'll discuss. Now, if you look at the act gives you an integrated institution, meaning there is central organization, there is state organization, there is district organization which will function. Now, when the act is being implemented, it is under the central union organization only that it will be functioning. So, in that sense, it is a centralizing tendencies. Funding will be from National Disaster Relief Fund only, and State Disaster Relief Fund will be given fund from the NDRF in case there is an insufficiency. So that is also again a centralizing tendency. Now, in this context, how was it invoked in the time of pandemic? Whether it was actually invoked, whether the spirit of the act was actually followed. The act says what? There should be a national plan whenever it is invoked. So first of all, this act was invoked during the pandemic under a health disaster. There is no clear-cut provision in Disaster Management Act about health. So this was again a sort of overreach by the parliament. Other than that, when it was invoked also, there is a proper procedure. There should be a national plan on the pandemic, coordinating with the centers, coordinating with the states. There was no national plan. This is what even Kapil Sibal was making an argument in the court that there is no national plan. It's federalism is being attacked. It's in this context only your MP lad scheme money was also taken up. So federalism was somewhere compromised or breached during pandemic. Now, what I said, health as a subject is not related to it, and health is a state subject. Now, technically speaking, legally speaking, Epidemics Act 1897 was to be invoked. So, in this context, why Epidemics Act should be invoked? Because Epidemics Act 1897 directly deals with health, and it is under this, it is the states which can enforce certain things. It is state which is the nodal authority for declaring or imposing restrictions. Center has limited powers, like in regarding ports, vessels, and ships. So when you compare the act also, DM Act versus Epidemic Diseases Act, this was actually which was needed. This was what was necessary or unnecessary, we'll discuss, but this should have been given more preference. That is why it affects federalism. Now, thereafter, we'll give the debate. Fourth part is Farm Act. How do you look at the debate of centralizing tendencies? Technically, under the Constitution, the separate division of powers is clear. Agriculture is a state subject. Agriculture, certain aspects of that are in the center. That is, they are invoking the recently farm bills. They are invoking in entry 33. That is that to concurrent list in terms of commerce, production, supply, and distribution and import of products of any industry. So under this, they are reading agricultural products also. But remember that agriculture is not trade in India. This is trade. Agriculture is occupation. So by legislating on farm bill also, they are somewhere encroaching on the territory of federalism. So what have I argued? Constitution gives you certain centralizing tendencies. Now, whether these bills were in the spirit of the Constitution, etc., is what we are discussing. Now, how is it violative? How these three acts are violative, and how Disaster Management Act, how it is less violative is what I'm trying to argue. First is, when you look at Farm Act does not follow these doctrines which are used in federalism, doctrine of pith and substance. In case the doctrine of pith and substance is what? It looks at the essence of subjects, the subjects in the list. It looks at the essence of the laws in case they are conflicting. So just because there are superficial or letter of the law, what we call, so words which are there related to agriculture, does not mean that the subject comes under the center. So you have to look at the essence. And also it is very clearly said that what you cannot do directly, you cannot do indirectly. So there is a clear division of powers between the center and state. So you cannot directly legislate on agriculture. So you cannot do it indirectly also. That is clearly given under colorable legislation doctrine given in Kameshwar Singh versus State of Bihar. Entry 33 is an indirect way of legislating. It is barred. Now, my overall analysis of whether these three acts were in line with the idea of constitution, when I say constitution does have centralizing tendencies. But one thing, So I'm matching whether or assessing or evaluating these acts against the Constitution. The Constitution has certain unitary tendencies for a specific reason. One, to protect the territorial integrity of India. Now, that clearly shows the spirit of Constitution is what? You can turn anti-federal or rather non-federal or centralize it to protect the territorial integrity. Look at the emergency purposes, emergency provisions also. What does emergency provisions say? Again, protecting the territorial integrity. And emergency purpose is like, what is emergency provision? You can turn non-federal in certain specific cases for some amount of time. Now, when these are the two broad principles which Constitution outlines. Now we have to match whether these three acts are in line with the Constitution or not. The first two acts, when you look at, that is DM Act and Epidemics Act 1897. See, dire circumstances were there in the pandemic. Technically, it had to come under Epidemic Diseases Act because health provision was not there under Disaster Management Act. Now, still it was brought under Disaster Management Act. So what we can say, conclude is, dire circumstances need dire solutions, but due process of law had to be followed. When you say due process of law, more powers to the state, things like consultation with the state. There was no national policy on pandemic where center state coordination was not there, taking away MPLAD, etc., where all not due process of law was not being followed. So invoking powers under Disaster Management Act is not a problem, but due process of law has to be followed. So what I'm trying to say is, you can argue that we are using DM Act and Epidemic Diseases Act because there was some sort of emergency. But what about Farm Acts? Farm Act is a normal circumstance. It is a regular affair. There was no urgency, there was no emergency. At any cost, this is a pure violation of federalism, and federalism is a basic feature. It is up to the court to declare these acts invalid because agriculture is a state subject and remains as a state subject. It violates the spirit of Constitution is what you're trying to say. So in total, if you look at the answer, what I have said, constitutional provisions, reasons for centralizing tendencies, three different acts, then I've analyzed whether these acts are according to the constitutional principles or not. This required a detailed understanding of the subject. Next is, again 15-mark question, judicial legislation is antithetical to the doctrine of separation of powers as envisaged in the Indian Constitution. In this context, justify the filing of large number of public interest petitions praying for issuing guidelines to executive authorities. So look at the statement, what it is saying. It is talking about one subject, that is judicial legislation. It is antithetical to this. So in this context, do you think PIL should be allowed, or that is the question overall? First is, talk about what is SOP and how judicial legislation is a violation. Separation of powers means powers are not concentrated or in one particular organ. There are three different organs for three different functions: legislative, executive, and judiciary. This idea of separation of power was given by Montesquieu. It is very prominent as an idea in presidential systems. Now, separation of powers has certain principles. No person should be part of more than one organ, non-interference in each other's matters. Third is promoting harmony. So these are the major ideas of separation of powers. What you also have to say is India does not strictly follow separation of powers, but there are certain provisions like separation of executive from judiciary, separation of parliamentary proceedings from judiciary. You cannot inquire parliamentary proceedings in judiciary. In judiciary. So 121, 122, all are related to separation of powers. But judicial legislation means what? Judiciary is making laws. That is the meaning of judicial legislation. The judiciary is giving guidelines, judiciary is giving directions, etc. So judicial legislation is principally a violation of separation of powers. So how did this come up is what we are discussing, because we have to address the other part. Now, judicial legislation, give the definition, give the examples. What are the examples? It all starts during 1970s with the public interest litigation. For example, Vishaka guidelines in 1997, these were the guidelines for preventing sexual harassment. It is based on these Vishaka guidelines only. Prohibition of Sexual Harassment Act 2013 was passed. So what is the Supreme Court doing here? It is making laws. Firecrackers, directions were given not to burn firecrackers, green crackers, etc. This is again laws. RTI appointment to be made transparent, guidelines were given recently. So criminalization of politics, guidelines were given. NRC, entire NRC process is happening under the judiciary. Those are also part of legislation doing executive functions. Now, all of this are showing what? This is a breach of, this is judicial legislation, it's a breach of SOP. Now, what you have to argue is, what it is saying in this context, justify the filing, whether you feel judicial legislation is needed or how PIL promotes it, how whether PIL as an idea is necessary or not. So first is, why such kind of actions are taken by judiciary? First is, there is a specific context attached to it. There has been a continued neglect by the executive. Executive is not looking into environmental aspects, executive is not looking into social justice, women issues, etc. There was continued neglect. Somebody had to do it, judiciary did it. Now also, whenever there is a reform needed in the executive or the parliament, they don't take it up. For example, criminalization of politics. Their judiciary came into picture. Now for this, a platform was given by PIL. Now public interest litigation changed the locus standi. Earlier it was the aggrieved party only who could go. Now PIL makes it the interested party also. Through this, judiciary gets more powers and it starts looking at issues or looking into issues where a continued executive neglect happens. Now NGOs also start coming up in 70s and also in 1990s who use this route to challenge the executive and the parliament. And also fundamental rights, from protecting fundamental rights, judiciary starts protecting social justice, and international developments also are linked to this because environmental aspects post 1990s become important. India had to implement all of those. So through judicial route it happens. Now what have I done in this? I have explained as to why judicial legislations happen and what is the importance. The importance is replacing or not replacing, doing the role of what executive is neglecting, doing the role of social justice, environmental protection, etc. was necessary. So I have justified the importance of PIL through these arguments. Now at the end, what you're saying is there is argument against also. What are the argument against? The argument against is judiciary growing excessively strong. Second is it's an unelected body, but it is undercutting democracy. Third is whether judiciary has the expertise to do all those things. In environmental legislations, how can judiciary, because firecrackers, decision they gave, but they were not, they did not think about what will happen to those people who have lost jobs. So the lack of expertise. So all of these are arguments against. Now what you're trying to conclude at the end is, technically, it has to be a job of the executive. And for a strong executive and a strong parliament, you need a vibrant democracy which chooses the right politicians. And till the point you have a vibrant democracy, you have one specific route, that is judiciary. That kind of a conclusion is what you're trying to give. Next is, the strength and sustenance of local institutions in India has shifted from their formative phase of functions, functionaries and funds to the contemporary highlight the critical challenges faced by local institutions in terms of their functionalities in recent terms. Now, what is it saying? The subject is local institutions. The strength and sustenance is what it is talking about from formative phase. Formative phase is when they were established. This was the problem. Today, the problem is this. So, it is saying identify the critical challenges in terms of their functionality. So what is the basic idea? It is saying when local governments were established, the problem was 3 Fs. Today the problem is just functionality. Do you agree with this statement? So how do I organize my answer? Part 1, I'll introduce local self-government, what it is, and what are the central principles involved in it. Local self-governments got a constitutional position to 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment, 1992 and 1993, based on the idea of devolution of powers and decentralization of powers. Now, the devolution of powers as an idea, it is given in the Constitution itself. 18 functions and 29 functions respectively were to be devolved. Not only this, they needed a strong, not only functions, they need not only powers, they needed funds also. They needed an administration for themselves to implement them. Now, what was the problem initially with respect to local self-government? The problems were with respect to devolution, the devolution of all these three. When I say devolution of all these three, what does it mean? Taxation powers, devolution of powers in general. Though it was so, and devolution of, and when you just have funds and powers, it does not mean that you will be effective. You need an administration of your own to implement them. So why was this not happening initially? It was because there was no constitutional obligation. In the constitution, it's not obligatory that you, because when you look at the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, what they say, it is not obligatory to devolve these. It is just discretionary. So many states did not devolve the functions. There was no political will because states wanted to arrogate the powers, do not want to devolve. There was systemic weakness. What is the systemic weakness? On one side, there was a centralizing tendency, and the other side, there was a devolving tendency. Centralizing tendency is state government, then the agencies of the state government, district magistrate, etc. The other side, you had local governance. So all of this created some sort of problems for devolution. But over years, what we have realized is there has been some sort of continuity in terms of conduction of elections. You have seen large participation of women. You also have seen many powers are being devolved now. So the question says that now the problem is not 3Fs or devolution, the problem is functionality. So how am I arguing the functionality problems? The three things which I have said. Devolution is happening, participation of women is happening, property, there are devolution of taxes also. How it is not being used? What is functionality? The problem of functionality means they are not being put into practice. Functionality means practice. Why are they not being put into practice? Those are the problems of functionalities. Identify the challenges of functionality. First challenge is use of certain powers. If you read the economic survey, you'll get to know that certain municipal bodies, though they have strong powers in property taxation and all, they have not used. There are many reasons for this. The best example is BBMP in Bangalore collects only 5% of taxation. There are many reasons. One is there is no strong supporting system for collection of taxes. There is no technology to identify properties. So recently what they have done is they have tied up with ISRO to identify the properties. So this way, this is a problem of functionality, implementation. Second is, though powers, funds, etc. are given, unless the bodies, unless the people who are elected, they are skilled in terms of their functions, there cannot be a strong local body. That's functionality. So women are elected, but women are remotely controlled by men. And not just women, you look at any general members of the Gram Panchayat, general members of the members of local bodies, other municipalities and all, there is no specific training and scaling involved. That is the problem of functionality again. So having powers does not is just a beginning. What you also need is training. Skilling and training of functionaries. Skilling and training of, first of all, functionaries are very less. For example, functionaries means what? They are called the local bureaucracy. They are called street bureaucracy. Just like state government has district magistrate and all under them to implement functions, local governments, first of all, they have less number of functionaries. Those functionaries are not trained, which we call the street bureaucracy. Other than this, in functionality, when they are implementing certain things, there are parastatal agencies which create clashes, like DRDA, District Rural Development Agency, is a parallel agency which runs counter to local bodies. Ministry of Rural Development, it functions under. So local bodies, panchayats, are meant for rural development. There is one more body under the center, they are clashing. This is a problem. What I'm trying to say in this point is there is no right environment for their functioning, though powers are there. Next is in terms of accountability. In terms of functionality, a good panchayat will be one which is accountable to the people. Even today, accountability of the people is by the people or from the accountability from below is very less. Accountability is more vertical. And more important is lack of good governance practices, meaning today there is e-governance, digitization, etc. Most of those things have not reached the local body. So what I'm trying to argue here is it is more about functionality. But my argument is not complete because I still feel that problems exist even in devolution of 3Fs even today. I'm counter arguing. So what I'm trying to say, even today there is no, so it is not written in the constitution that I said that devolution of powers is not given in the constitution or it is not made obligatory. So it should be made obligatory so that all states devolve powers to the local agencies so that true decentralization happens. And very important thing is when you talk about functionaries includes people who are not only elected, people who need certain officials to work under them, what we call the street bureaucracy. So here what I'm saying is 3F's project is still not complete. You need administration, you need more, or you need a stronger basis for devolution that it should be made obligatory within the constitution itself is what you're trying to conclude. Next is the 14th question. Again, and technically it's the 9th question, 15 marks again. Rajya Sabha has been transferred from a useless stepney tire to the most supporting organ in the past few decades. Highlight the factor as well as the areas in which the transformation could be visible. Now, one thing is very clear, this is again from the political discourse which is happening in India. A question slightly trumps you. I mean, it takes you by surprise because it is just the reverse. What you are seeing of Rajya Sabha is today, what you are seeing that it is becoming a weak body, but it is just challenging by saying that it has grown stronger in the recent decades. It is not saying in recent times. So this is one question which I have seen which was challenging. And second is the question related to Quad. Quad is moving towards economic and from being a security body, that's also reverse. I mean, I'm not calling it challenging because I'm saying it is just reverse. What is the traditional idea which you have that is being reversed? So with respect to what does it say? It says that initially it was a useless stepney tire, today it is being transformed. And when you say transformed, it is past few decades it is saying. So it is talking about highlight the factors as well as the areas where you see its rise. The first thing is talk about, so it is a question about what is the real vision of the Rajya Sabha, how it is growing in practice. So vision of the constitution related to the Rajya Sabha is what? Rajya Sabha is part of that bicameralism idea, wherein if one body is a populist body, the other body has to check the populism. Diffusion of powers is the central idea in Rajya Sabha. The other thing is Rajya Sabha members are elected by the state. So this was to protect federalism. So two ideas, bicameralism and federalism, drive Rajya Sabha, meaning basically it is diffusion of powers, basically more power to devolution of powers and all. So less of populism is that idea. Now, why was it a useless stepney tire immediately after independence originally? So when you look at the situation immediately after independence, first thing is Lok Sabha was a very strong body with towering personalities. It was so that people who were ethical, who had towering personalities, got elected also. So that way, Lok Sabha got huge prominence. Rajya Sabha did not get huge prominence because Rajya Sabha did not actively assert itself. Why did Rajya Sabha not actively assert itself? Because there was no need. Lok Sabha was doing its job. So Rajya Sabha just became a confirmatory body. So Lok Sabha would lead. That was how it was originally. That is why we call a useless stepney tire. And very important thing is not only because of what kind of leaders were elected to Lok Sabha, it is also because of some structural issue. Party system in India. Now, usually what happens, when will Rajya Sabha become a very powerful body? Rajya Sabha becomes a powerful body if Lok Sabha has one party, Rajya Sabha has another party members. But during the time of independence, both of them, Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, even states, there was one single party, that was Congress. So there was one party dominance. And what happened technically is what I said. Rajya Sabha's members are elected by the MLA. So Congress members elected Congress MPs in Rajya Sabha. So basically there was no difference between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha during the initial period. As a result, it was a mere confirmatory body, useless repetitive in that sense. Just it was confirming whatever Lok Sabha did. But situations changed in recent decades. When I say recent decades is the term used. So I'll be counting it from 70s and 80s particularly, how Rajya Sabha has shaped into a different kind of a body due to the politics of the time. So it goes as a most useful supporting organ, yes and no, both I'm talking about. Post 1990s, you see an emergence of regional parties. So 67 it starts, 80s it becomes humongous, and that is why you see there is problem of defection, lack of stability. You have Anti-Defection Act, etc., all being passed. Now, many regional parties, when they are coming up, naturally the composition of Rajya Sabha will be different from Lok Sabha. Different party will be there. They will be expressing their interests. So it started acting as a check on the Lok Sabha. And very important thing is post 1990s coalition politics came into picture. So no single party was dominant, and as a result, many regional parties started establishing their views, or they started establishing their strength, or pitching forward their strength in Rajya Sabha, trying to counter the effect of Lok Sabha. And very important thing is post 1990s, Rajya Sabha gets an institutional structure to support. Post 1990s, you see federalization of politics. Parliament needs committee systems because there are many new issues coming up. That is why you see in 1993 DRSC come up. So similar, and by now you have 24 committees and 10 committees are functioning directly under the Rajya Sabha. This is one big change which supports Rajya Sabha today. How it supports, we'll discuss. Next is excessive populism of 1970s, maybe under Indira Gandhi or under the present government, that need to be checked. Now, the only body which can do when Lok Sabha goes excessively populistic is Rajya Sabha, and I'll give you examples wherein how Rajya Sabha has played a key role. So, what I have discussed here, I have discussed factors why Rajya Sabha changes from being a mere confirmatory body to a body which tries to curb Lok Sabha. What are the areas? One is, I said, when regional parties started to exercise an influence, regional parties started to elect members, regional interests came up. And if you see the number of PMs being coming from Rajya Sabha, that increases drastically after the coalition politics. So HD Devegowda, IK Gujral, Manmohan Singh, all of the coalition politics era. So becoming a PM from Rajya Sabha is another region where they express their regional interest. Next is many bills went to a committee. So if you look at the other thing which I said, committee system became a very supportive system, came as a support for Rajya Sabha. And if you look at the recent bills which are being passed and all, there is one allegation against the Lok Sabha that most of the bills, important bills, are not going for committees. So in that case, Rajya Sabha has come as a help. Rajya Sabha has appointed committees for various kinds of bills. So discussion which is being compromised in Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha is playing a role. Now the last thing is, very recently you can see that Rajya Sabha members were one who expressed their displeasure against the farm bills. They opposed the farm bills, and there were 10 members who questioned it, etc. So what is all of this showing? I've discussed areas where they are expressing in terms of interest, in terms of discussion, in terms of committee system, in terms of leaders who are emerging and all. But can we say that it is becoming the most useful body? See, Rajya Sabha is always a decap. It's a body which is incapacitated. I mean, it's not a body which is all powerful as Lok Sabha. So when you say that it is the most useful body, yes, it is useful body in terms of populism, but it needs a very strong support system to work as a truly bicameral system in India. Now, bicameralism is a strong feature in countries like in US and all. There is better bicameralism and all. So what you are trying to conclude is, yes, it has played a good role. It has played a due role. I mean, it has played a role which was envisioned by the constitution as a balancer of the Lok Sabha, or a balancer of, or as an organ which curbs populism. But you need strong support systems to Rajya Sabha to make it a strong federal body is what you're trying to conclude. The last question is 10th question. Again, 15 marks. Which steps are required for constitutionalization of a commission? Do you think imparting constitutionality to National Commission for Women would ensure greater gender justice and empowerment in India? National Commission for Women had been in news for many number of reasons. Even in Hathras case, even prior to that, in terms of various rape cases and all, NCW was playing a role. Now, constitutionalization is in news because NCBC has been made into a constitutional body. What it is saying, steps required. And do you think this constitutionalization of NCW will ensure greater justice and empowerment? Give reasons. So my argument basically is not very, I mean, constitutionalization will improve the functions or the power of NCW, but for gender justice and empowerment, you need a larger idea is what I'm trying to argue. The first thing is give a introduction related to two bodies, statutory and constitutional bodies, because that is what the question is asking about. Independent institutions may be statutory, they may be even executive bodies through executive orders, they may be constitutional. Some bodies which are established by the act are called statutory, which are established by the constitution or constitutional bodies. And constitutional bodies enjoy more power or not in the more power and also more stature or prominence. Rather than saying more power, in terms of their gradation and ranking, constitutional bodies are ranked higher. So recently, NCBC as a statutory body was converted into a constitutional body under 103 through 103 Constitutional Amendment Act. What is the constitutionalization process? How can you convert a body into a constitutional body? First simple procedure is you need a constitutional amendment. You insert an article for it in the constitution. Okay, so how do you insert an article? It has to be done through a constitutional amendment. Now, how is a constitutional amendment done? Give the procedure in Article 360. Special majority. Introduction of the bill can happen in any of the houses. Then passed by both the houses through special majority. No joint sitting, no veto power for the president. Now, NCBC was given a constitutional position through 102 constitutional amendment. 103 is your economically weaker sections. 102 constitutional amendment. So this was done through this particular route only. Now the question is whether constitutionalization of NCW will help in bringing or making an effective change. First is NCW today is a statutory body established through the Act of NCW 1990, enforced, body was formed in 1992 later. The Act is 1990 Act. Now, whether constitutionalization will help it. What will constitutionalization do to it? The constitutionalization will make it as part of the constitution. Will it bring any effective change? The only change which I can say. So now, as of now, NCW has same powers as NCAC. There is no change. NCAC is a constitutional body. NCW is a statutory body. Powers are almost the same. Powers of a civil court only. So technically, making it a constitutional body doesn't make a big change, but it does make some small change. What is that? If there is a case where there is a clash between NCW and NCAC, it is always NCAC which will be preferred because it's a constitutional body. So it is here NCW is graded less. Otherwise, power-wise, they are equal. Now, then we have to analyze why do you need to constitutionalize or what are the actual problems with the functioning of NCW? It's not just the problem with NCW, it's problem with most bodies, constitutional bodies also. First is summoning does not attract, if you violate summoning, it does not attract punishment. So if it is functioning as a civil court and it is summoning somebody and that person does not attend the summon, then it cannot impose penalties. This is a power which is there with National Commission for Human Rights. It is not there for any of the bodies, maybe constitutional, maybe statutory. So this is one problem, the actual problem. There is investigation power given, there is no support system, forensic support, etc. all are needed. like in cases related to rape and all, there is less investigative support. Many times there are clashes between the state political agencies and NCW. That coordination is not there. Funding very under budgeted, all of this. Not only this, HR human resource capacity is also weak. Now, looking at all these, what I'm trying to say is the problems are these. Now, these problems will not be addressed if you make it into a constitutional body, unless you actually write it in the constitution saying that these are given to them. So, what I'm trying to say is you can make it a constitutional body, it is needed. But along with constitutional body, you make it, these provisions also should be included, like proper support in investigation, funding, summoning, etc. When these are made, that is when it becomes an effective body. So there are two things in this. You make it a constitutional body, you add this, it will be very difficult to change it because it is now in the constitution and you need a special majority. This is where a constitutional body enjoys more power. It's easier to change the powers of NCW, it is difficult to change the powers of NCAC. So what I'm trying to say is make it a constitutional body, but at the same time, also strengthen it by giving it some actual powers. So then it will be very difficult to change, and this will actually bring a change in, or this will actually lead to gender empowerment and all. So along with this, what we have to say is with institutional mechanism, it's not like just with institutional mechanism you can change things. Along with that, you need proper social regeneration, that is social reform, etc., to make gender parity, gender equality, etc., that equality a dream come true. In that context, what you need is gender sensitization. So here what you're trying to say is this body can play a key role in bringing gender sensitization. I hope this discussion helped you, and I'll be coming up with the discussion of IR and also governance part. Governance has 6 questions and IR has 4 questions. Thank you, and also do well in your options. Thank you. Have a great day.